Welcome to the Brief News Network.
We find ourselves at an extraordinarily precarious moment in Middle Eastern geopolitics, one in which a ceasefire that was announced with considerable fanfare is already showing signs of severe structural stress, and where the consequences of its potential collapse extend far beyond the immediate combatants to encompass global energy markets, the integrity of international alliances, and the fundamental architecture of maritime commerce that underpins the modern world economy. Let me walk you through exactly where things stand, because the situation is genuinely complex, and the contradictory signals emanating from all sides are generating confusion, not just among observers and analysts, but among the very ship owners and commercial operators whose daily business decisions are now being directly shaped by events unfolding in real time. The ceasefire is holding, but only barely, and with no guarantee whatsoever that it will survive the next 24 to 48 hours in its current form. When Pakistani mediators announced the cessation of hostilities on Tuesday evening, the agreement was understood, at least by the Iranian side, to explicitly include the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah operating in Lebanon. That was a foundational component of Tehran's understanding of what had been agreed to. The language of the announcement, as the Iranians interpreted it, placed the Lebanese theater of operations squarely within the ceasefire's protective umbrella. The very next morning, Israel launched what can only be described as a ferocious and extensive military assault against Hezbollah positions throughout Lebanon. More than 200 people were killed in a single day of strikes, a casualty toll so severe that Lebanon's government declared a national day of mourning in response. The scale of destruction was not ambiguous. It was not a minor incursion or a limited retaliatory strike. It was a comprehensive offensive operation conducted in the immediate aftermath of a ceasefire announcement. Iran's reaction was swift and unequivocal. Tehran's position, articulated with considerable force by its deputy foreign minister in communications with international partners including the BBC, is that what Israel carried out constituted a grave and intentional violation of the agreement that had just been reached. The Iranians are not treating this as a matter of interpretation or ambiguity. They are characterizing it as a deliberate breach, a conscious decision by Israel to exploit the ceasefire announcement while continuing its military objectives in Lebanon. The United States and Israel, for their part, are advancing a fundamentally different reading of the agreement's scope. Their position is that the ceasefire as constructed does not cover Israeli operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon, that the Lebanese theater was either not explicitly included or was subject to different terms than the broader Iran-U.S. framework. This interpretive gulf between the parties is not a minor technical disagreement. It represents a foundational dispute about what was actually agreed to, and that dispute now sits at the center of the ceasefire's viability. Iran has not, as of now, announced a resumption of hostilities. That is an important and meaningful distinction. Tehran has not walked away from the table entirely, and it has not ordered its forces back to offensive operations. But it has issued a pointed and direct warning. Unless the attacks on Hezbollah cease, Iran will not travel to Pakistan for the negotiations that were supposed to begin this weekend, the talks that were expected to be led on the American side by Vice President Vance. In diplomatic terms, this is as close to an ultimatum as you can issue while technically remaining within the framework of a ceasefire. The message Iran delivered to Washington and to the international community was characteristically blunt. You cannot simultaneously claim to honor a ceasefire agreement and continue conducting military operations that Iran explicitly understood to be covered by that agreement. You cannot, as the deputy foreign minister put it, have your cake and eat it too. The choice, from Tehran's perspective, is stark. Either the United States uses its influence over Israel to halt the Lebanon strikes, or the negotiations that represent the best available path to a durable resolution will not take place. Against this backdrop of diplomatic uncertainty and military ambiguity, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which a substantial portion of the world's traded oil flows every single day, remains in a state of effective paralysis, and the situation is not improving. The numbers tell a story that no amount of official optimism can obscure. In the period since the ceasefire was announced, shipping traffic through the strait has not recovered. It has declined. Yesterday, 11 vessels transited the strait. Today, that number has fallen to 4. For ships moving through one of the most strategically critical maritime choke points on the planet, a waterway that, under normal pre-war conditions, would see hundreds of vessels passing through daily. The reason for this dramatic reduction is not primarily a physical obstruction, though the threat of physical obstruction is certainly real. It is, at its core, a crisis of information and predictability. Ship owners and maritime operators are receiving contradictory, incompatible signals from Iranian authorities about the conditions under which passage might be permitted. Revolutionary Guard commanders have stated that the strait is open, but only on the condition that vessels approach Iranian authorities first and accept Iranian escort through what may or may not be a minefield laid across the shipping lanes. The word may or may not is doing extraordinary work in that sentence, and it captures precisely the impossible situation that commercial shipping now faces. Layered on top of this navigational uncertainty is a financial one of potentially staggering proportions. There are reports, not yet fully confirmed but circulating with sufficient credibility to influence commercial decisions, that Iranian authorities may require payment of approximately $2 million in cryptocurrency as a transit fee or toll for passage through the strait. The implications of this, if it becomes a formalized requirement, are profound and far-reaching. Before this conflict began, transiting the Strait of Hormuz was a routine commercial operation. Now, ship owners are being asked to pay what amounts to an extortion fee to a government whose intentions and capabilities remain deeply uncertain for passage through a waterway that may contain explosive ordnance whose location is unknown. Under these conditions, the rational commercial decision for the overwhelming majority of ship owners is straightforward. Wait. Stay at the northern end of the Persian Gulf. Hold position. See whether the situation clarifies, whether the rules of transit become definable, whether insurance underwriters are willing to provide coverage for the journey. Because here is the fundamental reality that shapes all of this. The decision about whether the Strait of Hormuz is effectively open or closed is not ultimately a military decision. It is a business decision. Specifically, it is a decision made by the insurance carriers who must be willing to underwrite coverage for vessels attempting the transit. If the actuarial risk of sending a ship through the strait is assessed as prohibitively high, no commercially rational operator will send their vessel, regardless of what military escorts might be available. The Iranian oil tankers that are moving through the strait are doing so under entirely different commercial logic. That oil is not entering the global market in any meaningful sense. It is moving directly to China under arrangements that exist outside the normal framework of international maritime commerce. The broader global market is receiving no benefit from that traffic whatsoever. For the purposes of the world's energy supply and the economies that depend upon it, which is to say, essentially every economy on Earth, the strait remains effectively closed. Despite the grim picture on the ground and at sea, the American side is projecting a posture of what might be described as disciplined optimism, an insistence that the diplomatic pathway remains viable even as the conditions surrounding it deteriorate visibly. Vice President Vance, returning from a separate diplomatic engagement in Hungary, maintained publicly that the United States finds itself in a fundamentally strong position. His characterization of the situation, the strait is open, the ceasefire is holding, talks will proceed, stands in notable tension with the observable facts on the ground. But it reflects a deliberate strategic communication choice: project confidence, maintain the appearance of control, and avoid doing or saying anything that might cause the Iranian delegation to conclude that walking away from the negotiating table serves their interests better than remaining at it. The vice president acknowledged that there are effectively two parallel tracks of Iranian communication operating simultaneously. On one track, there are what he characterized as good faith, productive back-channel conversations with Iranian interlocutors, substantive exchanges that suggest a genuine Iranian interest in reaching some form of durable arrangement. On the other track, there is the public Iranian posture, which has been considerably more confrontational, statements that the ceasefire has been violated, warnings that negotiations may not proceed, and signals that the Revolutionary Guard's position is considerably more hardline than that of the diplomatic ministry. This dual-track dynamic is not unusual in Iranian diplomacy. Tehran has historically operated with multiple, sometimes contradictory communication channels, reflecting genuine internal divisions between different power centers, the presidency, the foreign ministry, the Revolutionary Guard, and the Supreme Leader's office, rather than simple bad faith. Understanding which track reflects actual decision-making authority at any given moment is one of the central challenges facing American negotiators. The vice president is traveling to Pakistan accompanied by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, who has played a significant back-channel diplomatic role in prior administrations. The Iranian delegation is expected to travel separately, though the precise composition and authorization level of that delegation remains a critical unknown. Negotiating with Iranian representatives who lack actual authority to commit the Revolutionary Guard to any agreement would be an exercise in diplomatic theater rather than genuine conflict resolution. Simultaneously with all of this, the relationship between the United States and its NATO allies is experiencing a level of tension that has no clear precedent in the alliance's history. The president's meeting with NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg lasted approximately 2 hours behind closed doors and was, by all accounts, a tense and difficult encounter. The president's frustration with NATO's response to the Iran conflict has been expressed with characteristic directness and without diplomatic softening. On Truth Social, he wrote with evident anger that NATO was not present when American action was taken and would not be present if American action were required again in the future. He appended a pointed reference to Greenland, described as a big, poorly run piece of ice, in what appeared to be a deliberate reminder that the American president views the entire relationship with European allies through a transactional lens that most NATO members find deeply uncomfortable. The alliance's position, as articulated by Secretary General Stoltenberg and by European member governments, is structurally coherent but politically awkward. NATO is constitutionally a defensive alliance. Its foundational purpose and its legal framework are organized around the principle of collective defense against aggression directed at member states. The American and Israeli strikes against Iran were offensive military operations, not defensive responses to aggression against NATO territory. By NATO's own doctrine and legal structure, the alliance had no obligation to participate and indeed would have faced significant internal political difficulties had it attempted to do so. Several NATO member nations did provide meaningful practical assistance, allowing American forces to use their bases, granting access to their airspace, facilitating logistical operations that supported the campaign. That contribution, while real, falls short of what the president appears to have expected or demanded. His frustration seems to be less about specific operational contributions and more about a perceived failure of political solidarity, a sense that allies who benefit substantially from American security guarantees should be more willing to stand publicly and actively alongside the United States when it undertakes major military operations. The European perspective is more complicated than the president's framing suggests. European economies are directly and significantly impacted by disruptions to the Strait of Hormuz. The continent imports a substantial portion of its energy through that waterway, and the current crisis is already generating pressure on European fuel supplies that could, if prolonged, require fuel rationing measures. European leaders are simultaneously trying to maintain their relationship with Washington, manage their own public opinion, maintain the legal and political integrity of the NATO framework, and begin organizing a potential Hormuz policing coalition for the post-conflict period. That is a genuinely difficult set of competing demands, and it would be unrealistic to expect European governments to navigate them in ways that perfectly satisfy a White House operating under its own political pressures. The question of whether lasting damage has been inflicted on the NATO alliance is one that deserves serious consideration rather than reflexive reassurance. Experienced observers with deep personal investment in the alliance's success, individuals who built careers within its structure and who understand its value from first-hand experience, acknowledge that some damage has occurred. The more optimistic assessment is that this damage is recoverable, that the institutional foundations of the alliance remain intact, and that the strong bipartisan support for NATO within the United States Congress provides a stabilizing counterweight to the executive branch's current posture. The more sobering assessment is that trust, once genuinely undermined, is not quickly or easily rebuilt, and that allied governments making long-term strategic and defense investment decisions are now operating with meaningful uncertainty about American reliability in a way that was simply not true 5 years ago. Perhaps the most important analytical contribution to understanding the current crisis comes from those with deep operational military expertise, because the instinctive assumption that American military dominance can simply solve the Hormuz problem reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the tactical and strategic realities involved. The straightforward truth, delivered by those who have spent careers thinking about exactly this kind of maritime security challenge, is that securing the Strait of Hormuz against Iranian interference is not realistically achievable through military means alone, regardless of the scale of force applied. The explanation for this counterintuitive reality has several dimensions. The geography of the strait is deeply unfavorable to any naval force attempting to guarantee safe passage for commercial shipping. Iran exercises territorial or operational control over both sides of the narrow waterway, creating overlapping fields of fire and surveillance that cannot be neutralized without effectively occupying Iranian territory. This is not a situation comparable to open-water naval operations where superior firepower and mobility can be translated directly into operational dominance. More fundamentally, the nature of the threats that can be deployed against commercial shipping in the strait has been transformed by technological developments that have occurred over the past several decades. During Operation Earnest, in the 1980s, the last major American effort to protect commercial shipping through Hormuz, the threat environment was relatively conventional. Today, the menu of options available to Iranian forces or to Iranian-aligned irregular groups includes unmanned surface vessels, unmanned aerial vehicles, unmanned subsurface systems, swarm attacks by small high-speed boats carrying munitions large enough to inflict catastrophic damage on oil tankers, and a range of improvised weapon systems that can be manufactured in workshops and garages rather than in industrial military facilities. Precisely targeted air campaigns can destroy known weapons depots and identified military installations. They cannot eliminate the capacity to build and deploy weapon systems whose components are commercially available and whose assembly requires no specialized industrial infrastructure. The practical implication is that even the most capable naval force in the world, and the United States Navy is unquestionably that, cannot provide ironclad security guarantees for commercial vessels transiting the strait under current conditions. Naval escorts can reduce risk. Combined naval operations by multiple allied countries can reduce it further. But they cannot eliminate it to the level that insurance underwriters require before they will provide coverage for commercial vessels making the journey. And without that insurance, the commercial shipping calculus does not change regardless of how many warships are present. This leads to the conclusion that the only durable solution to the Hormuz crisis is a diplomatic one, some form of negotiated understanding with Iranian authorities that reestablishes predictable conditions for maritime transit. The unprecedented element in the current situation is the proposition that Iran could exercise a permanent toll-collecting authority over traffic through the strait. That passage through one of the world's most critical international waterways would require payment to the Iranian government as a condition of transit. This would represent a fundamental transformation of the legal and commercial framework that has governed international maritime commerce for generations, with consequences for global industry that would be difficult to overstate. Before this conflict began, transiting the Strait of Hormuz was a routine, cost-free commercial operation. The idea that it might now permanently require a $2 million payment to Iranian authorities, essentially a tax on a significant portion of the world's energy supply, is not just a logistical inconvenience. It is a structural change in the economics of global commerce that would ripple through every economy on Earth, and that would establish a precedent with implications extending far beyond Iran and the Persian Gulf. The path forward requires successful negotiations in Pakistan, a resolution to the interpretive dispute over the ceasefire's coverage of Lebanon, sufficient restraint from all parties to keep the diplomatic framework intact through the weekend, and ultimately some form of durable understanding about the conditions under which the Strait of Hormuz will be accessible to international commercial shipping on terms that the global economy can sustain. That is a great deal to accomplish in a short period of time, against a backdrop of mutual suspicion, competing internal political pressures on all sides, and a military and geopolitical situation whose complexity resists simple resolution. But it is the only pathway available because the alternative is a prolonged crisis whose costs will ultimately be borne not by governments or military establishments, but by the ordinary citizens and economies around the world who depend on the free flow of energy and commerce through that narrow and suddenly very consequential stretch of water.